welcome to a new episode of our Chartwell tutorial series. I'm your host, Travis, and today we're going to be going over the basics of using Chartwell on the web. This video assumes you already have a basic knowledge of how Chartwell works, so if you're new to Chartwell, I suggest you first check out our basics tutorial. You can find a link in the description below. Previous versions of Chartwell didn't work very well on the web. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but there are some bugs in browsers, such as Safari, that result in broken charts, especially if you're using more than one color. There were a few versions of Chartwell which included JavaScript workarounds, but they weren't ideal. However, in the latest version of Chartwell, which can be found on vectortype.com, we have implemented a solution allowing you to use the fonts without JavaScript, just some simple HTML, CSS, and the web fonts. The syntax is slightly different and a little more verbose, so I thought it would be helpful to go over the basics. You can find information and examples of the alternate syntax in the Chartwell manual. And by the way, this is also the same syntax for using Chartwell in Figma. All right, let's dive in. Let's start with a basic pie chart. If we refer to the user manual, this is what the normal Chartwell syntax looks like. And below it, the resulting chart. We list our values, each separated by a plus, color them, turn on discretionary ligatures, and then we're left with this chart down below. And as you can see, each wedge reflects the value. So the 10 is the small one, the 30 is the medium size wedge, and the 60 the large one. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, if we use this syntax on the web, we'll end up with a broken chart like this. So how do we actually get Chartwell to work on the web? So first, here's our basic setup. We've got a simple HTML file, an external CSS file, which is shown here on the right side, and then we've got a simple div with our basic Chartwell syntax. And I'm not going to get into the specifics about using fonts on the web, but I am using the font face feature to embed the WAF2 file and setting the font family to Chartwell Web Pies. Because Chartwell doesn't have normal weights and widths, I usually specify the style of the chart in the font family name so that I can have multiple kinds of charts on the same page. And so if we load the HTML file, this is what we have. It's not doing anything, so first we need to activate our discretionary ligatures. And we can do that in the CSS using the font variant attribute and then giving it a value of discretionary ligatures. And if we save and reload, we end up with this. It's actually snapping into the pie chart, but now it needs to be colored so we can actually see the different wedges. There are a lot of ways to do this. This is the web and it's pretty open. The way I like to do it is wrap each value in a span tag, and then which I can then target to give a separate color. And so let's do that. And now I could add a class to each span tag to target them separately. Instead, I'm going to use the nth child pseudo class like this. And so this will target the first span and give it color of orange. This one will target the second, give it a color of purple. And this will target the third one, give it a color of blue. Let's save and hit refresh. And there you can see it's broken. This is expected though, since we're using the basic syntax. On the web, we need to add a little more context for each value. It's pretty simple though. And if we go back to our user manual, each style has its own alternate syntax, which you can find under each page, under the web and Figma alt syntax. For pies, the way it works is that after each value, you need to append an underscore and then the sum of all of the previous values. Essentially, we're telling the value where it should start. And it assumes that you're starting at 0, so the first value actually doesn't need anything. But the second value will add an underscore and then a 10, because there's a 10 coming before it. And then on our third value, we'll add an underscore and then the sum of the two previous values, which is 40. And this will allow you to create a chart that actually locks into place. Let's jump back to our code here and actually implement the new syntax. Again, we can ignore it for the first value since it's starting at 0. In the second one, we'll add an underscore 10. And the final one, we'll add an underscore 40 for the 30 plus 10. Save, refresh, and there we have our nice looking chart. And if you want to add a donut or turn this into a ring chart, we can append this syntax for that in another span. I'll add a span tag at the end here, and then plus x90, and I'll actually move the plus into here. And then I'm going to give this one a class of Chartwell donut. And then in the CSS, I'll give it the color of the background color. Save, and then refresh, and there's our donut. One other thing to be careful with is spaces in your formula. For example, if we were to break these into separate lines to make it a little more readable, we'll end up with a broken chart. And the same thing would happen if we had spaces in between each value. Broken chart. So you need to make sure that there aren't any spaces in your syntax between span tags or inside span tags, and that your entire formula is on one single line, and then it should work. So that's the basics of using Chartwell pies on the web, but Chartwell includes 14 other styles, and each one has a slightly different alternate syntax due to some logistics of each style. I'm not going to go over each style in this video because it would frankly be quite a long video. However, in our GitHub page, I'm going to post some examples for each style. And then you can also check out the user manual, which I have right here. For each style of chart, it describes how to use the alternate syntax as well as some examples. And some of these don't really have too much of a workaround to get around. For example, lines and areas and bars. Since these are all one color usually, you don't really need anything for the core syntax, but you might need something for the grid or reference lines. In some of the more complicated styles of charts like radar and rows, these have more verbose alternate syntax. Unfortunately, this is just kind of required because we need to add a little bit more information so each segment knows where to start or how big to be. And again, you can find all the alternate syntax in the manual. And you can find the manual on vectrotype.com on the Chartwell page. At the top, there's a big download manual button. That's it for this episode. We'll be back soon with more Chartwell tips and tricks, so be sure to subscribe to our channel. Feel free to let us know in the comments if there's anything you'd like to see in future videos, and you can purchase Chartwell as well as our other cool fonts at vectrotype.com. See you next time.